Hello again, everyone. It's great to be with you. This is the 25th Sunday after Pentecost, and our gospel this morning is from the 12th chapter of Mark. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth about a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Have you ever given your opinion about something and then said, and that's my 2 cents worth? When we add our 2 cents worth to a discussion, we let people know that, yeah, this is what I think, but I could be wrong. I'm no expert. Take it for what it's worth. It's just my opinion. And do you remember sound bites? We don't hear about them much anymore, probably because they were replaced with tweets. But back in the late 70s, yeah, I was around then, before Twitter limited our self-expression to 140 characters, someone coined the phrase soundbite to describe a short, memorable quote that summed up an important point from a longer speech. A soundbite was someone's way of saying, "Here's my 2 cents worth." In seminary, preachers are taught to hone in on one big idea for a sermon, condensing the main point into a short statement. Basically, we're trying to get a whole sermon into one soundbite. It's a useful tool when trying to figure out what the most important lesson is in a passage of Scripture. What's the one big idea that will help the congregation most? How do we apply that lesson from thousands of years ago to our lives today? How can we state that idea so concisely that it will be easy to remember and worth at least 2 cents? As a seminarian, I knew I was getting close when my professor said, "That'll preach." And then there's a passage like today's gospel lesson, 6 short verses packed with infinite layers of meaning. Trying to get to the core meaning is like peeling an onion. You just keep going, and suddenly there's no onion left. How do you get that one big idea to pop when there are so many layers? Maybe it will help if we review what has been going on in this story. You see, Jesus and his disciples had been walking beside the temple that King Herod took years to build. The disciples had been pointing out the large stones that formed the temple foundation. This is the same temple, by the way, that Jesus predicted would be destroyed, a prediction that will come true about 40 years later. So what is the main point Mark is trying to make here? Why are these 2 short paragraphs hooked together? One warning to watch out for the scribes, and one about a poor widow putting in her last penny into the treasury. Could there be more than one way to interpret this passage? And if so, which interpretation applies to you today? If you had to offer your 2 cents worth, what would you say? You might start by peeling back the most obvious layer. Give like the widow, not like the rich people who only drop in their spare change. Since Jesus has been calling us into a discipleship that gives up everything for the sake of the gospel, this would be a valid interpretation. And it would make a pretty good soundbite, too. You could tweet it, get plenty of likes. My preaching professor might even say, "That'll preach." Though it may be true, being called into sacrificial living, not just sacrificial giving, is only one layer of this story. If we look more closely, we can see that giving like the widow means contributing to a systemic problem. The poor give everything they have for the sake of the rich. Jesus never intended for the rich to get richer on the back of the poor. It's quite possible Jesus points out the widow as an example when he says, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses so they can go around in long robes and claim places of honor for themselves." Think about this interpretation, explains why Mark hooked these two stories together. One illustrates the other. Instead of holding up the poor widow as virtuous compared to the wealthy who give out of their abundance, Jesus might be trying to help us see that both sides of this equation are wrong. Both the poor widow and the wealthy scribes are examples of a corrupt and broken system. You see, Jesus didn't come to just put a Band-Aid on our brokenness. He came to heal it. Jesus came to usher in a whole new system, a whole new way of living together as children of God. That'll preach too. You can tweet that because it's ultimately true. But again, it's just one layer. This passage can make people feel guilty if they identify with the rich scribes, or feel self-righteous if they identify with the oppressed widow. But maybe there is yet another layer to the story. Maybe it's the coins, the all she had to live on. What if you were to think of yourself as those two coins being given to God? Instead of the scribes who devour widows' houses, or the widow who foolishly contributes her whole means to a corrupt system, what if you saw your part in this story as the gift itself? How can you invest yourself? How can you contribute to God's purpose and mission? You may not think these coins amount to much. Sometimes, though, our faith doesn't amount to much either. But if that's all we have to live on, how can we make sure that we don't squander the gift? Allow me to offer another way of looking at this passage. What if the focus of the story is not so much about the scribes or the widow, but on what Jesus does? Among all the people putting money into the temple treasury, Jesus notices her. And maybe the lesson Jesus wants his disciples to learn here is simply that: to see her, to acknowledge her person, her being, her plight, and her offering. She is not an object lesson, but a person, relatively invisible, yet worthy of Jesus' attention and ours. We can easily refer to the widow as less fortunate, but when we call someone less fortunate, we are automatically labeling them as that person as less valuable than we are. Neither poverty nor wealth have anything to do with luck. There are times when a person's financial condition changes because of circumstances beyond their control, but most often, our broken social system determines the difference between poverty and wealth. Whether you are rich or poor, you can't write off this widow as less fortunate. You can't think of her as a statistic. She is real, and whatever Jesus wants us to learn from her, perhaps the first lesson is to notice her, to see her, and all the people like her who pass through our lives, ignored or forgotten. Today we honor veterans who have served our country and who are often forgotten or ignored. We also remember those service members who gave their lives in combat for our freedom. It is the 106th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. People called it the Great War because it was supposed to end all wars, but it didn't. 2 nights before the 20th anniversary, another event took place that would eventually lead us into a Second World War. Beginning on the night of November 9th, an organized campaign of street violence broke out in Germany and Austria, aimed at Jewish businesses and families. That event became known as the Night of Broken Glass. The streets were littered with broken glass from the windows of synagogues, homes, and Jewish-owned businesses. That night, more than 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. Clearly, the problem wasn't that the Nazis didn't notice the Jews living around them, but rather that they would not see them as genuine persons deserving of love and respect. Indeed, they saw them as opponents to be feared. When we do not notice people, we are apt to forget or ignore them. When we do not notice them, yes, that's what happens. When we do not see others as humans because we have been taught to fear or despise them, we are likely to treat them inhumanely, which is a sin, a shame, and a crime, as we've seen played out all too frequently in recent history. According to FBI data, there were 11,643 reported hate crimes in the U.S. in 2022. This number has steadily increased year over year. Stuff like this happens when we stop seeing each other as human beings, when we keep putting our 2 coins into the corrupt system that destroy life, instead of investing ourselves in the life-giving work of loving God and neighbor. The old system can't stand. The temple will fall down. Only Jesus can change our lives and give us hope for a future when people will stop hating each other and start loving each other instead. A future when weapons that kill get hammered into farming utensils that can help things grow. A future where peace and justice fill every corner of the new heaven and the new earth that Jesus promises. But it isn't just a future that gives us hope. Jesus calls us right now to see the widow and to recognize her deepest need. It's the same need we all have. We all need to be cared for in a way that only God can care for us, to be loved in a way that only God can love us, to be seen as only Christ can see us. Maybe that's the final layer of the story, the part where we can step in and take our place next to the scribes, next to the wealthy,